Watch these hands for a second. There's a mound of dark, grayish flour on a wooden board, and a craftsperson is adding water, not all at once, but carefully, feeling the flour change under their fingertips. And here's the strange part. This dough doesn't want to come together. It's granular, almost like wet sand, cracking at the edges even as it's coaxed into a ball. The person working it isn't fighting it exactly, they're listening to it. What looks like a simple bowl of noodles is actually the answer to one quiet, high-stakes question every serious soba shop has to settle before it even opens. What ratio? Because in soba, that single number tells you everything. So let me explain what's actually happening on that board, and why it's so hard. Buckwheat isn't like wheat. It's not even a grass. It's a pseudo-cereal, the seed of a flowering plant that's more closely related to rhubarb. And the crucial thing it lacks is gluten. Gluten is that stretchy protein network that forms when you work wheat and water together. It's the reason udon can be stretched and ramen can be pulled, the reason most noodle doughs are forgiving and springy. Buckwheat has none of it. Mix pure buckwheat with water and it behaves more like wet sand than bread dough, granular, fragile, cracking at every turn. That's the central problem of soba making. So the craftsperson faces a choice. Add some wheat flour to hold everything together, or work pure buckwheat and accept how difficult that is. That's the ratio. And here's what no manual can teach. Buckwheat dough responds to the day itself. The temperature, the humidity, even the particular batch of flour. The exact amount of water, the way the dough feels resisting the hands, the moment it finally comes together, none of that is measured, it's felt. Experience alone teaches it. That's why a craftsperson who can reliably make pure buckwheat soba by hand sits at the very top of the soba hierarchy. Let's walk through the two big paths that ratio can take. First, the pure form juwari soba, literally 10 parts. 100% buckwheat, no wheat, no binder at all. It's the oldest form and the hardest. Since there's no gluten to rely on, the craftsperson has to create cohesion another way. The most traditional trick is to hydrate the flour with hot water instead of cold. The heat partly cooks the starch, and that gives the dough just enough stickiness to hold. Some makers even use separately gelatinized buckwheat starch as the binder. Buckwheat binding buckwheat, no other grain involved. Every one of these methods depends on the maker's judgment for that specific batch on that specific day. Now the practical path, nihachi. 2-8. 80% buckwheat, 20% wheat. This is the most eaten soba in Japan, the benchmark everything else is measured against. That 20% of wheat brings gluten, and gluten changes everything. The dough can be rolled thinner without tearing, cut more evenly, boiled without falling apart, and it comes out smoother with a little spring. It's also far more forgiving of temperature and humidity. The trade-off? You've displaced 20% of the buckwheat, and with it, some of the grain's flavor and aroma. Nihachi is subtler, more approachable, the everyday noodle of old Edo, eaten quickly and cheaply the way a modern city eats sandwiches. And between those two extremes lies a whole spectrum, each with its own name. Kuwari at 90% buckwheat, nanawari at 70, rakuwari at 60. Every step is a small negotiation between workability and intensity. Here's where the history gets wonderful. The first written mention of cut buckwheat noodles, sobakiri, comes from a temple record in 1574, noting that soba was served to workers repairing the main hall. And in those early days, it was all pure buckwheat. There's one word that carries this whole story of craft pride, teuchi, meaning hand-struck. Back in the Edo period, doughs heavy with wheat needed so much force to knead that people sometimes worked them with their feet the way udon still is. So a craftsperson making pure buckwheat soba entirely by hand coined that term in teuchi, to say essentially, my soba is made by hand, not by foot. It was a statement. I achieved something technically demanding without compromising the grain. This is the shokunin spirit, the Japanese ideal of a craftsperson devoted to mastering a single thing completely. And it's genuinely at risk. Even in Tokyo, where soba shops are dense and fiercely competitive, the number that reliably serve handmade juwari is small. When soba gets industrialized or cut with cheap flour, that intensity and that skill quietly disappears. Japan's labeling rules only require 30% buckwheat for something to be sold as soba, and at 30%, there's very little of the grain's real character left. So what does all this judgment actually produce? Taste juwari and it's unmistakable. A bold, nutty, earthy buckwheat flavor with a slightly rough, dry surface that grips the dipping sauce differently. It breaks more easily too, but that fragility is inseparable from its purity. Taste nihachi and you get something smoother, springier, more harmonious, the everyday pleasure of a noodle made honestly and served quickly. And there's a beautiful final gesture. Sobayu. At the end of the meal, the server brings the cloudy, warm water the soba was boiled in. You pour it into your leftover dipping sauce and drink it. A light, faintly buckwheat soup that recovers the nutrients dissolved out during cooking. Nothing is wasted. The technique extends to the very last drop. This is not just a noodle. It is a craftsperson's entire philosophy, written in the ratio of one grain to another. If you want to go deeper into the craft and the people behind it, we've covered everything in detail over at Weigh-In. The full technique, the history, and the producers. Link in the description. See you next time.